What we're going to be doing today, though, is talking about qualitative field research for the next 45 minutes or so, the process and tools that goes into that, understanding what goes into research and really what makes that happen. We're not going to be talking about quantitative, numerical type of research. We're not going to be talking about choosing methods or even how to be a researcher. The spoiler for how to be a researcher is everyone in this room can be a researcher. If you ask a question, if you want to understand something, you are a researcher. But if you happen to make it to the workshop tomorrow, we will go into more of that about the choosing of the methods and synthesizing research and things like that. We have 3 sections to cover over the next 45 minutes or so. Start and spend most of our time around planning and preparation, spend a little bit of time being out in the field and conducting our research, and we'll conclude by talking about finding the patterns and how we actually find those insights and communicate those insights. So let's start with planning and preparation and talking about everything that goes into making research happen. And let's first start by agreeing or discussing why we want to plan. We want to plan our research because it validates our initial assumptions about existing research. I have a belief that anything that is older than 6 months is not research, it is not active data, it is a hypothesis. So if someone says, we have information from a survey we did a year ago, that's too old for me, that becomes a hypothesis. Or if someone says we've never done research but we believe something, that's a hypothesis. We plan to get those hypotheses, to get those expectations out in the open so everyone thinks, has an idea of what they are, and we can then validate them through our research. Planning also helps us ensure we cover all of our necessary topics. This is a 45-minute conversation we have today. I want to make sure I cover certain points, so I plan the conversation. It's the same way with any type of research. We have a finite amount of time, sometimes only 10 or 15 minutes, more often maybe about an hour. We really want to make sure we cover the important points to validate our hypotheses, to explore the unknown and uncover new opportunities. Planning helps us ensure sessions flow smoothly. We want these to be conversations. We want them to be natural. We can only do that by being comfortable with the planning, comfortable with what's happening there. And planning helps us reduce design debt, which reduces technical debt, which allows for more effective products, more effective solutions overall. So agreeing now that planning is important, let's talk about some of the work products or tools of the trade we use in planning our research. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of tools that we use in research. This is a list of things that I find extremely valuable. Either do not forget about these, they are must-haves, or there are a few that are really critical depending on the type of research you're doing, and I'll talk about those in turn. The first one I want to touch on is the test plan. A really great resource for a sample test plan is usability.gov. That's the sample we have on the screen here. This is a one-page document that summarizes the research we're doing. It's what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we plan to speak with, and what we expect the outcomes to be as far as the direction of the outcomes. When I say this is a one-page document, I mean it's a single-page document, front only. It's not front and back, there's no staples, no paper clips. The reason for that is this is meant to be the thing that you can hand someone in the elevator or hand someone in passing. They can scan it and get an understanding of what you're doing and why. This is what we hand to our our key stakeholders, the executives, our managers who might not understand research as much, where they understand what is it David's going to be spending the next 2 weeks or 2 months doing. There's this one-page summary for that. This one-page summary is sort of the table of contents for everything else we're going to be creating for our research documentation. That's going to include things like the recruitment screener. This is really important after we have our personas or our roles or our market segments. The recruitment screener allows us to now market and determine who do we actually want to speak with. Who is the best person from a scheduling perspective, from a behaviors, from a demographics? Who do we want to speak with? Let's make sure we have the right folks. If we are outsourcing our recruiting, which we'll talk about how we recruit our participants, we really need to have a really tight, really honed in screener. If we're recruiting participants ourselves, this might be a little bit looser, more of something written on the back of a napkin, but we always want to have some sort of recruitment screener. And the other thing we always want to have is some sort of interview guide. The interview guide or discussion guide, this is the script we use to follow our discussion. The first paragraph or so is my introduction. Hi, my name is David Farkas. We're here to explore this area of inquiry. We're not here to evaluate you or your skills or expertise. We want your candid and open feedback. So it's setting the ground rules, it's laying the tone. That's about the only thing I ever actually read word for word with my participants, because then we move very quickly into our contextual sections. The goal-based questions. If it's a contextual inquiry, can you show me how you do your work? If it's concept validation, can you show me how you would go through these steps on this prototype or on this tool. And that's where I really leverage a lot of the improvisational mindset, where things are changing all the time. I need to be fluid with the conversation. And I call these discussion guides or interview guides, and really don't think of them as scripts because I don't want to be that tight down to the conversation there. After the interview guide, one tool we have that often isn't used is the introduction packet. This is really important if you're doing any research in people's offices and especially in their homes. The introduction packet is something you can send either through mail or through email 2 or 3 days before you actually show up. And it should have the photos and the names of everyone who's going to be coming as part of the research team. In today's day and age of technology and digital privacy and security and physical privacy and security, it's really important that when you knock on someone's door, you show up at their office or their home, that they're expecting you and they know who to expect. So being able to see a photo of me and then I knock on their door really lowers maybe some of the risk or some of the tension involved in having the stranger coming into their space and having a conversation. Key contact information, your background, how to reach you, what you look like, it's really important, again, just so people have a little bit more familiarity, and it's one less thing to overcome when you're having that conversation, that research, where you already now have a bit more familiarity with one another. Travel logistics with planning, critically important. So I live in Philadelphia. It's supposed to be a 7-hour flight to Guadalajara, but I had a 3-hour layover that became a 6-hour layover because of a mechanical delay. I've been here since Monday morning, so plenty of time. But it's really important to map out routes. How long it takes me, how do I get here from Philadelphia? The 20-minute drive that could be 40 minutes from the hotel to this venue in the morning, depending on traffic. So even within offices, moving between this building, knowing as we move from one workshop or one talk to another, how much time we need is really important. Within an office complex, I've been in buildings where I need to change buildings or change elevator banks, and it could easily take 15 or 20 minutes just to move from one session to another. And I need to make sure I plan that in my schedule so that I'm not rushed. So when I arrive at the next session, I'm still, clean and composed and refreshed and ready for another session, and to treat each session as their first. Plan breaks, plan meals, avoid overscheduling. It's really easy if you, the researcher, are not creating your test plan for a project manager or a client to say, we'll do 6 sessions in a day, and you have no time to eat, let alone grab a glass of water. 3, maybe 4 sessions is the upper limit for a number of, qualitative type of ethnographic research in a given day. It's, quite frankly, fairly exhausting, and if you're thinking an hour, hour and a half a session, a half hour in between each, and a standard 8-hour day, 3 or 4 sessions is a healthy limit there. One other piece of planning, this one I haven't had to use, thankfully, in a number of years, is the team instructions. This is something I share. Normally, I just talk about it verbally, where I want research to be as inclusive as possible. I want it to be myself and the note taker, but also as many of my teammates, as many of my client stakeholders as possible to observe the research. The one thing I want to make sure, though, is that the research is a conversation, and that means it has to be the facilitator, the note taker, and the participant, and the 3 of us really discussing. Anyone else, whether it's through Zoom and online meetings or in person, if we bring someone else along, it's really important to make sure that they're sitting in a more observational only type of mode. So not that they're not chiming in, every question or every few questions. And I do that by making sure they understand there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. I'll pause at key moments, when we finish sections, to allow folks to chime in with their own area of inquiry. And part of the reason for that is we want to make sure we're asking the right type of questions. We want to make sure we're not asking leading questions. And the only way we can do that is if we have some control over it. So I mentioned I haven't had to use this document in a while. I have typed this up before. I have had my stakeholders initial the bottom that they've read this and acknowledged it. I've only had to do that in a handful of occasions where I felt my stakeholders were a little overeager, for lack of a better word, to chime in and interject themselves in a more formal research conversation. But more often than not, if I just verbally say, this is going to be myself and the note taker, we're going to facilitate it, there'll be plenty of time for you throughout, that's usually enough. So you shouldn't need this to be printed and signed and documented, but in some cases you do, and it's important to have that if you need it. The last document, I should say, is the notes worksheet. This is an example of using Microsoft OneNote for notes collection. Microsoft OneNote, Excel, whatever, even just copying the discussion guide and having folks either handwrite or type up their notes. It's really important to make sure if you have multiple note takers that everyone's taking notes in a consistent format. I really like using the discussion guides because I can actually code my discussion guide with what task I'm on, and I can use that as an anchor for everyone taking notes to be reminded of where we are and what page. That's especially helpful because I tend to jump around a lot. So if I go from task 1 to task 5 and back to task 2, I can then use those numbers and inform my colleagues where I am in the conversation. It makes it much easier to track. One thing I'll say about the notes worksheet is do not do this in a cloud-based tool. So don't take your notes directly in Trello. Don't take your notes in something that doesn't store locally. There have been a number of times where just transcribing my notes, the Wi-Fi has dropped out and I've lost the last 20 minutes of typing. I'm really thankful that that's not my only copy of the notes, that I had a local storage, because otherwise, especially if you're not recording, you've now lost those 20 minutes of conversation. So take them manually, take them locally. Don't rely on the cloud during the real time of research. So that's a lot about planning and the tools of the trade that go into planning. The next thing we really want to focus on is how do we know what questions to ask? This is really the key part of any good research protocol. And again, anyone can ask a good question, anyone can craft a good question with a little bit of background, a little bit of guidance. So let's first define what a good question is. A good question seeks to explore the unknown in a targeted and guided way, while putting the participant at ease to open up and provide feedback you might not have expected or anticipated. The key thing here is our discussions, our questions are targeted and guided. We know the type of information we want to hear. We don't know the answer we want to hear back. We're not leading our participants, but we know the area we want to explore. And the reason I'm focusing also again on not leading them is we're looking for that unexpected or unanticipated thing. If we knew what we need to design based off of market research or just sheer instinct, we wouldn't need research. So we're doing research because we're expecting our hypothesis to not be complete. There's something we're still looking to understand. There's something, either that truly innovative idea or whatever's happening underneath the surface to really inform us there. Now, when we think about a good question, there's a structure we can follow to build most questions. It has 4 key areas. For this example, we're going to use a hobbyist photographer and wanting to understand how folks take photos. So the first part of a question is the setup. We don't just want to ask, what do you take photos of in your spare time, but we want to provide a little bit of a framework here. So when you are on a photo walk, now there's a frame of mind, there's a setting. It's still pretty open-ended as to what you're doing. And now we ask our question, how do you decide what you're going to photograph? So a very tight, very succinct question. It's open-ended. You can say, automobiles, landscapes, people. Personally, I really enjoy taking photos of the street art and the graffiti I see when I visit different cities. The style is always very, very interesting with the culture. And this is a really nice question. We can have a nice conversation about this. We can get a lot of good information from our participants here. But that's not all we want to do. We want to explore more. We want to understand the deeper whys of things. Anyone with children or anyone with nieces and nephews know that little kids love to ask why a lot of times. And that's really what laddering is. Laddering is asking why, how, what, how many times do you do this? So when you're on a photo walk, how do you decide what to take a picture of? How do you decide if the picture's been captured well? How do you determine the lighting, the composition, the aperture settings, all of those different things? Now we have a lot more detail than just what do you take photos of, but how and why do you do those things? And then this is a conversation. This isn't meant to be, okay, I did this question, check it off, let me go to the next one. So we want a natural segue to the next question. Now that you've taken the photos, when do you edit them? Do you edit them in real time on your phone, or do you carry something with you? Do you do it back on your computer a day later, a week later, or the same day? Understanding that as a natural segue sort of moves us from one area of inquiry to the next. This question structure highlights a few key trademarks that we can highlight. So good questions are open-ended. So what do you take photos of is much more open-ended compared to do you take photos of cars or people? Saying cars or people is no, I don't take pictures of either of those, or yes, I take pictures of those. They're very shallow. They're very leading questions where the answer is either in the question already, so do you do this thing? And it's very shallow in the sense of it can be answered with 1 or 2 words, yes or no, sometimes, I don't know. Good questions balance specificity. So again, providing that framework of when you're on a photo walk allows us to understand hobby photographers who are carrying their camera gear on the go. They're not in a studio. So it's giving us a good balanced specificity of the type of engagement we're doing here, while not saying, you know, when you carry your tripod and your camera and 2 extra lenses, we're not leading them with that. And those good questions flow naturally. So again, that's where we talk about the segue from one question to the next and moving there. And we also want to avoid that personal or unconscious bias. So I mentioned a moment ago, I really enjoy exploring the street art and the various graffiti. If I said that in an actual research session, I would be leading the participant. I'd be sharing my own bias. And it's not uncommon for a participant to then want to say, oh yeah, I do that too, or I do something similar. Even if that's not their real passion, there's this desire, this instinct in all people to want to build relationships and sort of, you know, find likeness and find sameness. So by sharing my bias or my preference, I'm tipping the scales into one type of research or one type of results. And we really want to leave our biases, our preferences as researchers at the door. So we've defined what research tools and trades we need. We've defined how we come up with the good questions. Now, how do we find the right people to actually speak with? The first way, and probably one of the harder ways, is self-recruiting. Personally, this is where I'll say some personal bias. I avoid self-recruiting at all costs. This might be cold calls, email blasts of people, screening through Ethnio, but actually being the manual person to go through the tool and decide who you want to speak with, not relying on those. The one version of self-recruiting that I do rely on, that I do find value in, is friends and family. This is where I might email my coworkers and say, we're looking for folks in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area who have a certain either health history or have renewable energy, solar panels, something like that. And people will reach out to their friends and family and say, oh, I know, my neighbor just got solar panels. Let me put you in touch with them. That's a very low stakes, low risk, and low time version of self-recruiting, mainly because I'm outsourcing it to my entire company or my entire office. But for the most part, self-recruiting is extremely time-consuming, extremely cumbersome, and if you do it, plan for at least an extra week in your test plan, if not an extra 2 weeks. Recruiting really is a full-time job. Instead of doing self-recruiting, what I recommend much more is outsourcing your recruiting. Market research firms are a really great spot to gather people. This is where you need a really tight recruitment screener, because market research firms, while they have, you know, tens of thousands of people to poll as possible participants, their type of research is not our type of research. So they're typically looking for proof of concepts and, you know, understanding demographics much more. It's not necessarily typically as qualitative or ethnographic as what we do. So we need to be very tight, very precise about who we're asking to speak with, or we'll end up with a lot of participants, but not a lot of good data. Online user groups, this is sort of a mix of self-recruiting and outsourcing recruiting, but going to places like Reddit, like Facebook, going to the communities where your participants are. I've done this for a number of clients on Reddit and other social networks where I've found the various subreddits or communities where people are located, posted on behalf of the client, not being very honest that I'm a researcher on behalf of this organization, looking for to solicit responses, and people have been very willing, typically, in volunteering their information. Now, there's something to be said about the quality of information. If people are volunteering on a social network, I think we can all be aware that social networks and social feeds have a lot more negative reviews than positive. You know, the vocal people are going to be much more critical. So take all of your feedback with caution. But online user groups is a great way to recruit. My favorite way of recruiting, if you're not using the online testing tools at the bottom, user testing and Dscout are two great ones, is client recruiting. Our clients have a whole list of who their customers are, who their active customers are, who their leads are, and even better, who their customers are who haven't been active in a few months or who left the organization for a competitor. We can use all of this information and actually reach out to them with the client's permission, with the participant's permission, and now screen against those metrics and reach out to them for research. I really enjoy this because it does two things. One, it makes my life a lot easier. I'm not responsible for the recruiting and that extra week or two of time. But it also really gives our clients a lot of buy-in in and a lot more stake in the research. It helps them feel as though they are along for the ride, they are contributing to the research. It's not some external consultancy coming in and doing all of the work in this sort of, you know, dark space in the corner and coming back with the findings, but it includes them in the research process. One caution though with client recruiting is it's very easy to have a client self-selection bias. So the client's gonna select the best and the brightest participants. I often need to push back and say, all right, we have the folks who log in 3 times a day and are super contributors. I also wanna speak to the people who just signed up. I wanna speak to the people who haven't contributed in a while. Getting those participants sometimes is a little harder. It sometimes requires a little mix and match of online user groups and client recruiting, friends and family. So very often we'll use multiple methods all at once. So what is research, why plan, the tools to plan, how we ask a question, how we find people. We're now gonna move into our actual logistics and how we manage ourselves during the day of facilitating research. So we talked about travel time already a little bit, moving between offices or between cities, but I think it's worth repeating. Building access is another critical one. So I do a lot of work with financial service clients and life science clients. Generally speaking, I need to show my ID at the front desk, get a visitor badge. In some cases, if I'm there for more than 3 days in a row or 3 days out of a month even, I'll need to go through a full background check. So knowing if I need to do any type of background check, historical, how long that's gonna take is really important to being able to get access to the building to do the research. Dress code, super important. Again, a lot of financial life science clients in my history, I generally dress up a little bit more formally, slacks, a button down, sometimes a jacket in financial services, but dress code works the other way as well. This was me a few years ago at a farm in New York area, doing field research for a pharmacogenomics client. So how can we do basically 23andMe genetic testing for animal livestock to have a healthier herd of livestock? The dress code was definitely not slacks and a sport coat. It was big yellow booties and dressing as warm as I could. It was about -3 centigrade that day. It was freezing. But got to meet a lot of really interesting people who manage the farms, got to see the cattle in their I won't say natural environments, but where they live, and it was a lot of fun. The only reason we were allowed back there though is because I asked beforehand, do we need to do anything special visiting farms? And they said, oh yeah, you need calf-high rubber boots. It took me 3 locations, 3 hardware supply stores to find one that had boots in my size that I could slip over my sneakers so that I wasn't, wasting more time taking shoes on and off. And so my feet didn't freeze in the -degree weather. And then finding a workspace is critically important, again, with those logistics. So if I'm in an office in a financial services client, asking for an office or a desk that I can pull off and call my own, I can drop my stuff on. In the case of working on a farm here, what we don't want to do, whether we're at a farm or someone's house, is finish our research session, say goodbye, and then sit in our car in their driveway, organizing our notes, having our debrief. Google search where the nearest coffee shop is, where the nearest gas station is, just anywhere where you can drive 5 minutes down the street, reorganize your materials, have your debrief with your team, find a bathroom as you need, and anything like that. And lastly, with logistics, technology is not your friend. Whatever can go wrong with technology will go wrong. Even right now, this should be a little larger screen, and we're cut off a little bit. So this is about as good as it gets with presentation challenges, but technology acts up sometimes. You can avoid that though a little bit. Test your technology before each session. I have, this is now for me a mental checklist, not a physical one, but a start of day, making sure my prototypes, everything is organized, everything I need for that day is printed. At the start of session, making sure everything is reset. End of session, end of day, making sure everything is organized best I can so that I don't conclude 10, 15, 20 sessions over 2 weeks with papers in 10 different locations. I try to keep my paper very organized, very together. I'm a bit of an organization nerd here. I have anything I can do to sort of help facilitate organization, I do. This is a 5-star notebook. It's like a this thick notebook with 3 binder rings, and I have these divider folders in there. Each folder has a pocket on the front and the back, and what I do is each pocket is used for consent forms, honorariums, discussion guides, all of that physical material I need. The front has blank copies. I take them out for a session. I complete them. I put them in the back of each folder so they stay, all the consent forms stay together, all the honorariums, all the discussion guides, and it's very easy to find a new one versus a completed one. I'm a big fan of analog for my note-taking and for my discussion guides. I think there's something to be said about having a physical barrier as a facilitator between me and my participant. So I try very much to do everything on pen and paper when I'm taking notes, when I'm facilitating. Use what you feel comfortable with. If you are the note taker and you are using a computer, I highly suggest you find a consistent and calm tempo for your typing. It's distracting to participants if you're typing because they said something and then you stop, and then they say something interesting and you start typing again. It's this weird cue to the participant that, oh, I said something interesting, I want that again, and we have this feedback. So even if you just have to type, I'm waiting for the next thing, I'm waiting for the next thing, type whatever you need just to sort of have that slower cadence and make sure that the participant feels as though they can't use you as now I'm drawing a blank on the horse's name, but they can't use you as sort of a guide for when to speak up or when to contribute more. Again, with the logistics, we want to make sure there's dry runs, so we want to practice our research, we want to rehearse, we want to make sure we're comfortable with the discussion guide. This is because if we can practice and rehearse, we can then be much more present in our session. There's a great podcast, the Turnaround podcast with Jesse Thorne. There's a number of great quotes all about research and all about interviews. One, I believe it's from Audie Cornish, is practicing and preparation allows me to be in the moment of the conversation. So I'm paraphrasing there a little bit, but it's a really great quote because it really hones in on why we create all those preparation documents, why we do all those logistics. One thing I really want to say is find your own voice. I've been facilitating research for over a decade now. I have an idea of how I do my introduction, how I do my discussion guides. I've found when I hand my discussion guide to a colleague, especially someone who is newer to the industry or newer to research, if they try reading my discussion guide verbatim as it's written, they sound very stiff. What I've started doing is handing my discussion guide over as early as I can, and I'm asking them to rewrite it. Not because I want to give anyone busy work, not because I want anyone to sort of waste their time, but we all have different inflections, different words, different tones we use. If someone is unfamiliar with the discussion guide and they're trying to read it verbatim, it's going to sound stiff. If they have the opportunity to rewrite it, it allows them to read it and process the words a little bit more and also provide their own perspective, their own tone. So I highly suggest whenever you get a discussion guide, give it a good read over. Don't be afraid to redline it and mark up where you might change the words or change a sentence structure. Make sure you're not leading, make sure all the things we said about good questions, but don't be afraid to take ownership of a discussion guide as you move across a research team. So I said we're going to spend a lot of our time in planning and preparation, but finally we're able to go out and facilitate our research. And I should say this is pretty true for research in the real world too. I might spend 2 or 3 weeks planning, recruiting, preparing, only a week facilitating the research, and then we move out. So we spent a half hour talking about planning. This is a realistic display of time in a much smaller way. When talking about facilitating, there's a few things we want to do with as we facilitate. There's the introductions and warm-up. We don't just want to sit down right away and say, tell me about your finances and how you save for retirement. Tell me what scares you about, healthcare. We really want to ease into that. So, hi, my name is David, setting that friendly tone. I always have, some friendly questions, just background questions, how long folks have done, whatever job they're doing or how long they've been interested in something. If we're in someone's office or in someone's home, I try to find something that I can relate to, whether it's something sports related or just something, hobby related. I try to find something that I can talk to that's unrelated to our area of inquiry, just to build a relationship and just to feel more human with one another. We want to manage our flow. The main thing here, if anyone's a video gamer, knows that you never start the level 1 on the big boss. You start easy, it gets harder and harder and harder until you get to that boss level. That's really important with conversations as well. So starting with how long you've done the work, what's interested you in it, building that complexity. More importantly, knowing when to back off, knowing when a participant might suddenly be a little closed off or a little hesitant to respond to something, and knowing when to push further, where they want to tell you more, but you might just need a follow-up question, that laddering, to really be a little bit more open and a little bit more provocative with the feedback they're sharing. This is where I really leverage a lot of the improv techniques in what we do as researchers and what we do as facilitators. building off feedback, supporting our players. These are some key guidelines for improv. Collaborative Improv is a website I have with a lot of the rules and guidelines and games and activities. There is the book available, but some key rules here just to keep in mind. Yes, and whatever our research participant says, that is true. Our participants do not say anything untrue. We might not believe it, we might disagree with it, but we agree in the moment, perception is reality with our participants. We follow the funny. This is an improv notion that if something is strange or interesting, we follow it. We then make some comedic or dramatic show out of it. In research, we're following the interesting thing. Someone says they keep their password on the Post-it note in their drawer. That's interesting. You know, that's how LastPass and those other services came to be, is how can we change this interesting behavior that we know is unsafe, is unsecure, and how can we design for it? And how can we use mirroring or body language to change how we react, how our participant reacts? The last note I'll say on the book is I do have some copies available, so I'll be around, and we can talk about that at the end. But talking about body language also, there's a lot we have here. I can spend a whole day, a whole workshop just talking about body language, but there's a lot of verbal and non-verbal signs we have, both with our body, with our faces. I mentioned mirroring, but the main things I want to say are there's open body language. With open body language, I am exposed, I'm here, I am trusting you're not going to maul me or attack me, and there's closed body language. Closed body language allows us to protect ourselves. My voice is getting a little higher, a little faster. This isn't a trick, this is just what my body does when I move into this language. So as facilitators, we want to keep our open body language. We want to be engaged and receptive of what our participants are telling us, but we can use this to our advantage as well. If our research participant, if a client stakeholder is closed off, giving us short one-word answers, we can mirror their body language. And then over the course of the next 2 or 3 questions, we can slowly open our body language one limb at a time. What that allows is at the beginning, we're mirroring them. We look like them. We're both closed off. As we slowly open our body language, our participants are then going to open up their body language. I don't know why it happens this way. It's something psychological about just human behavior. I can definitely attest that it works. It's real. I've done it many times in client meetings, in research sessions, everywhere I've done it. So mirroring and being aware of our physical body language is a really important aspect of research and facilitation and anything like that. Energy levels, treat every session as your first, if that means swapping roles, so the facilitator and the note taker taking turns who's in charge, not overscheduling, I mentioned, and taking breaks. I drink a lot more coffee than I normally do, and I drink a lot of coffee when I'm doing research. And adding this, I know I saw some of the illustrations about COVID-19, limiting the handshakes in research these days, wherever we are, whatever you feel comfortable with, but being aware that there is health involved. So the mental health, the physical health, probably not extending too many handshakes in the conference setting, with research settings, being aware of that. Lastly, with facilitation, we want to be aware of our debrief session. There's a number of different type of debrief sessions. There's the daily sessions. This is really important. In the case of that farming research I did, we had 2 or 3 different research teams happening at the same time. We had daily sessions, a quick 15-minute call just to say, what did we hear? Is there any surprises? Do we need to change anything about our protocol? Team sessions and client sessions, those might happen more broadly than just the researchers. Again, and on a weekly basis, what are we hearing? What are we changing? Are there any surprises? This is really great for the clients also. Anyone who was able to shadow a research session can chime in and illustrate what they heard, what they wanted to add there, and all that. These can happen in person, these can happen remote. If they're happening remote, one thing I'll say is make sure everyone, if you can, turn your video on. One thing we're seeing a lot just with the global teams, the more we can turn our video on, the more everyone turns their video on, the better it helps our conversations, the better it helps our facilitation. That's true for research, that's true for our debrief sessions, that's true for any type of meeting there. So we've defined the planning, we've defined the logistics and the questions, we found our participants and asked them the research. How do we now conclude with the analysis and reporting? The first thing we want to do is consolidate our data. I define a data point as any single quote, action, or observation. So if there's a period or a comma in some cases in your note-taking, that's probably 2 different data points. But we want to gather all of them, we want to identify the key ones, and then we want to synthesize them. Tomer Sharon has the rainbow spreadsheet, which is really helpful depending on the type of analysis you're doing. Another common tool is affinity diagramming, post-it notes. This is one of the saddest affinity diagrams I've ever created. There's like 30 post-its here, but it worked for the workshop we needed, so it wasn't a bad thing. One thing I will say though is post-its have this funny way of falling off the wall. You leave overnight, the air conditioning kicks on, and they all fall off. Post-its also are not shareable with teams that are not located in the same place. So I've become a huge fan of using Trello for my synthesis. Trello is a phenomenal tool. It's not made for this, so you sort of have to get comfortable working on zooming out of your browser. But very quickly, all of these colors are different tags and notes. So every participant is tagged green, participant 1, participant 2, participant 3. I then tag opportunities, breakdowns, quotes, different things like that. I numerically tag it so it's 4.11, 1.4, that maps to my discussion guide. What this allows is I can then say, show me all the breakdowns, and I just filter for the breakdowns and I see all of the red cards, and I can start to see what happens, what the problems were at a very high level. Now let me see all of the opportunities about task 2.3, and I can type in 2.3 and see the opportunities. I can see where those are, and I can start to drag and drop and organize from my participant columns into key findings and implications. So I'm a big fan of Trello. I've been adopting this for a number of years. It takes a little while to get used to, and definitely takes getting the research team on board for. But what's really nice is I can then summarize each of these columns into, I use pink for the summary color, and then those pink cards basically become my slide presentation. And my slide presentation really depends then, once I know what those summaries, what those key findings are, based on who my audience is, what do I want to achieve, and what I really want to do, what I want to communicate, and what my goal is. So if my audience, if my goal is more business strategy or product roadmap, I'm going to be telling a very different type of story than discoveries and opportunities or tactical findings and next steps. I never create just one research document. I never create just one findings. I always try to have the one slide summary. These were the 3 good things and the 3 bad things. I then try to have the next version, which is, here's the 3 things that you need to take from that. So the 1 slide version, the 5 slide version, and then there's the 50 slide version, which is really more good for myself, onboarding new team members, introducing folks to the project. But that one, the 50 slide one, is a really great doorstop and really great for onboarding team members. But a research findings deck, I try to keep them all under 10 slides because that way we can really hit the key points and focus what the key points are for us. Now, I want to really hone this in. Research is iterative. So there's not, let's do research at the beginning discovery phase of a project and then move into design development and never remember research again. We can do research at any stage of our program. We can do research. It could take as short as a week or 2 weeks. We could pause and do a 2 or 3 month research program. But research is iterative. And we can really do it at any time. Anyone can facilitate research. Anyone can ask a question. And as we start talking about research ops and sort of how we operationalize and sort of mechanize research, there's a lot we can do about the workflow there, which again would be a whole separate conversation today. So what we covered today is planning and preparation, being out in the field, and finding the patterns at a very high level. Again, we'll talk more for those attending the workshop tomorrow about choosing methods and the synthesis there. I will leave you, though, with this adapted proverb: the best time to do research was last sprint. The next best time is today. There are a few resources I'll leave everyone with. The Turnaround Podcast, a few other books that are really great for asking questions, synthesizing, things like that. And as I mentioned, I do have collaborative improv with me today, discounted from what Amazon charges, because let's not give Bezos our money. Thank you.
Bueno, ok. Entonces, bueno, vamos a comenzar con una serie de, de preguntas. Y pues más que nada es, pues, el que tengan preguntas les vamos a regalar camisas. Tienen que pasar con Carlos, allá al fondo, para que les dé su talla correcta, pero pues obviamente participación. ¿Cuántas preguntas vamos a hacer? 5 preguntas, chicos. Entonces aquí ya veo una mano medio levantada. Entonces, ¿me pueden apoyar? Bueno, no hay otro micrófono, ¿verdad?
¿Se la pregunta así directa en inglés? ¿La traduzco? O? Okay. I have a question. How do you work on improving your soft skills? Because a lot of it is soft skills, right? About like being emotive, being, talking to people. How do you improve that?
Yeah, so how do I improve my soft skills? This is where the collaborative improv really comes into play a lot. This is my personal approach to it. I've been doing improv in some way since 2005. And improv allows a lot in active listening, in being engaged, in just being comfortable with unknown things. So I've found improvisational theater as a really nice way to translate into what we do as researchers, as collaborators. I think there's a lot of other ways where people might do that, mindfulness or meditation, whatever it is. But really, it comes down to being aware of yourself. And for me, as someone who just, I can't sit still for 30 minutes and just think, but I can, engage and be aware of my physicalness. Improv has been a lens where I've grown that muscle.
Hi, good morning. Analdi, I wanted to ask you, how do you convince your clients that you're asking the right questions during research field or?
So how do I convince the clients I'm asking the right questions? So at no point do I ever go away and say, here's my discussion guide, or here's the research findings. It always starts with, the client's brought us in and has asked us a question of, we want to improve a thing. So, we want to improve the e-commerce checkout flow. So we'll start having conversations of, where do they think they're having problems? Where do they think they're having challenges? We might open up the quantitative data, the analytics, and see where there's drop-off. And then we'll have a series of iterations, usually 2 or 3 versions of our discussion guide. This is what we would like to ask. Is this meeting your expectations? If it does, we can move ahead. If it doesn't, we'll have another conversation about what they're hoping the research uncovers. And there's usually a give and take. There's the questions I want to ask to know what we need to design. There's the questions they want to ask for something unrelated to the project. And it's finding the balance between those two in a way that they can see their fingerprint, their touch on the discussion guide, while honoring what we need to achieve.
Okay, por acá tenía una. Okay.
Vamos aquí.
Vale.
Hey, hello. Well, I have a question. Maybe it's just my case, or as a generational gap, or maybe even a geographical thing. But you mentioned Reddit as a good source where I can find or make digital groups. How much can I trust Reddit? Because I don't have an experience using it. And is there a way I can make a persona? So I can find a focalized group in Reddit, which is this persona, so I can make the questions, and how much can I trust the research I make on Reddit?
Yeah, so the summary of the question is, how much can you trust Reddit? And probably the short answer is, don't trust anything you read on the internet. The tongue-in-cheek answer aside, when doing any type of, social media recruiting, you definitely need to cast a wider net. You definitely need to recruit more people because you're going to see a lot of negatives there. In the case of the work I've done with Reddit, the client has been aware of the communities where their customers engage. So they were able to give us 6 or 8 or 10 different subreddits where we were able to know we were getting a good idea of the participants there. We still had a screener, so we still asked them, what is your job title? Do you do this type of work? And then if they passed that, we were able to send them to the evaluation. In this case, it was a card sort. So we were a little that even the outliers would be helpful in the research. But I think the short version is it does take a little bit larger pool of participants or of eligible participants, and you do want to take that information with a little bit more caution because the internet can be misleading.
Ok, acá, solo nos volvemos para... Está él y acá. Vale.
Hi, Mario. You mentioned to know when to push further in the test. How you handle how much to push the user without damage the feedback he's going to give you, not damage the test or make him anger or tired about the task you're doing it?
Yeah. So how do I know how much to push a participant and when I need to pull back? This really comes to some of those soft skills and just practice and being aware of the body language, being aware of how they say no to something. There have been times where I've asked clients about, how do you know this is the best product? This is for internal business systems and B2B type of tools, where the participant has said, oh, I can't, I don't like that because of, what the competitor does. And I say, well, what does the competitor do? And they respond, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. I go, well, do they do this or do they do that? And I give them two options. So I might give a leading question or a close-ended question, and then they'll say, I can't talk about it. By that second or third time that they start to say no, that's a cue to me that it's going to be a dead end. Another thing to be aware of, though, is this is where our note takers and our second person doing the research is really helpful. I've made this mistake before where I didn't hear that second or third no, and I kept asking. And my colleague, this was a remote session, sent me a message on Teams saying, back off, we're going to lose them. And I immediately saw that, took a breath, went to the next topic and all that. So research happening in pairs, listening to what your supporting team is telling you. If you get two no's, that's probably a good sign that you might want to move on.
Hi, David. My question is, assuming there are two different teams, a research team and a design team, what techniques or guidelines have you seen that work? How do you involve the design team so the research gets the most input, so the designers feel can see what you're finding out and can give you feedback and iterate on that research?
Yes, so no, that's a great question, and I'm going to extend it. How do we know not just the research team passing off to the design team, but the product team, the client team, and everyone else? And that's where the researcher, the facilitator, should be someone who understands qualitative research, how to ask the questions. The note taker should be anyone and everyone. I've brought my designers, I brought my business consultants, I brought my delivery managers as my note takers. And just by being there, by seeing it, they feel involved in the process. It's not just David going off asking funny questions. It also makes them an advocate. So, oh yes, I heard when we saw the agents struggled in this area, and they can have more buy-in into the findings. So empower everyone else on the team to be the note takers, empower everyone to join during facilitation. The moment we go to Trello or the rainbow spreadsheet or whatever it is, that's an opportunity for everyone on the team to participate, not just the researchers.
Thank you very much.
Ok, vamos a tener aquí la última pregunta.
Todos los que preguntaron al final vienen conmigo, porfa.
Hello, David. Thank you very much for your time, for being here, for sharing this beautiful presentation with us. And I want to ask you, how do you do to share the information with your client in a way that everybody understands what you got? For example, your team, do the job, do the design, do the code and everything, or you share the findings to other people, probably people from your client, and they do the job? How do you make sure they get the information?
Yeah. So how do I make sure the client gets and understands the findings that we want to share? There are two main things I do here. One is I try to capture quotes as much as possible. So quotes and photos, video clips if you have, but that's harder in today's day and age. But quotes really go a long way. If the clients were able to shadow some of the sessions, having a quote from a session they were participating on is a nice anchor, a nice recall there. But the second thing I do is I try to, in that 10-slide presentation, separate the tactical from the strategic findings. So tactical research findings are the things we can do. We can start designing, start coding against tomorrow, so it gives clear next steps and shows the immediate value. We did this research, and now we can improve in these ways. And the other type of findings are the strategic findings. These are the things that you as the business might want to investigate a little bit more opportunity on, us as researchers might want to do a little bit more inquiry on. So being able to separate what we can change today and what we might need a little bit more conversation on provides realism and provides truth of, seeing the value immediately to the clients.
Okay, well, we want to thank you, David, for all the time, the effort that you put to come here. So, in name of the community, we want to give you this.
Thank you.
Thank you.